The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before it was supposed to ring. Elena Martinez had been awake for the past hour anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a butterfly with broken wings. She'd been awake because little Sofia had been coughing again, that persistent wheeze that made Elena's chest tighten with worry and the knowledge that she couldn't afford another doctor's visit this month. Elena's bare feet hit the cold linoleum floor of their cramped apartment, the same floor where a loose tile had been promising to trip someone for the past 6 months. She'd asked Mr. Henderson, their landlord, to fix it at least a dozen times, but his response was always the same apologetic shrug, followed by promises that never materialized. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The apartment was located above Rosario's bakery on the east side of Millbrook, a town that had seen better days but still held on to hope like an old woman clutching her purse on a crowded bus. The smell of fresh bread was already wafting up through the floorboards, which meant Mrs. Rosario was starting her day even earlier than Elena. It was a comforting scent, one that reminded Elena of her grandmother's kitchen back in El Paso, where Sunday mornings meant the whole family gathered around a table that was too small, but somehow always had room for one more person. Those days felt like someone else's life now, a movie she'd watched long ago and could barely remember the ending to. Elena moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who had choreographed every movement to save precious seconds. Coffee first, the cheap kind that came in a can and tasted like burnt dreams, but it was hot and it was caffeine, and that's all that mattered. While it brewed in the ancient coffee maker that wheezed and gurgled like an old man with emphysema, she checked on her children. Sofia, her 5-year-old, was curled up in the twin bed they shared, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Even in sleep, her breathing was labored, each exhale a tiny whistle that made Elena's heart clench. The pediatrician at the free clinic had said it was asthma, probably triggered by the mold that Elena suspected was growing behind the bathroom wall. He'd prescribed an inhaler that cost more than Elena made in 2 days, so Sofia went without, and Elena lay awake at night listening to her daughter struggle for breath. In the other bed, barely 3 feet away in their studio apartment, 8-year-old Miguel slept with the determined stillness of a child who had learned not to take up too much space in the world. His school clothes were laid out at the foot of the bed, pressed as well as Elena could manage with the iron that only worked if you held the cord at exactly the right angle. Miguel was the responsible one, had been since he was 6 and understood that Mama needed help. He never complained about the generic cereal for breakfast, or the fact that his shoes had holes that Elena covered with duct tape painted black with a Sharpie. Elena allowed herself 30 seconds to watch them sleep, 30 seconds to memorize the peaceful expressions on their faces before the day's worries crept in and reminded them that childhood was a luxury they couldn't quite afford. Then she was moving again, because time was a resource she had even less of than money. She dressed in the uniform of her first job, the burgundy polo shirt and black slacks that marked her as an employee of Sunrise Diner, where she worked the opening shift from 5:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. The shirt had a small tear near the left shoulder that she'd mended with thread that was almost the right color, and the slacks were starting to shine at the knees from too many washings and not enough replacing. But they were clean, always clean, because Elena had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about having nice things, it was about taking care of what you had. The walk to work took 18 minutes if she hurried, 23 if she walked at a normal pace. Elena always hurried. The streets of Millbrook were quiet at this hour, just her footsteps echoing off the empty storefronts and the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. She passed Martinez Auto Repair, which wasn't owned by any relation despite the name, and the old movie theater that had been closed for 5 years but still had "now showing" on the marquee, like a promise that maybe, someday, the lights would come back on. Sunrise Diner sat on the corner of Main and Elm like a beacon of grease and hope, its neon sign flickering the word "open" in pink letters that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee that could dissolve paint, and locals came for breakfast that stuck to your ribs, and conversations that lasted longer than they should. Elena had been working there for 2 years, ever since she'd moved to Millbrook with nothing but 2 children, 3 suitcases, and the kind of desperation that makes you brave. The owner, Bill Hendricks, was already there when she arrived, as he always was. Bill was 68 years old, with hands like baseball mitts and a heart that was bigger than his business sense, which was probably why the diner barely broke even most months. He'd hired Elena when no one else would, when she'd walked in with Sofia on her hip and Miguel holding her hand, all 3 of them looking like refugees from their own lives. "Morning, Elena," Bill called from behind the grill where he was already starting the hash browns that would feed the early crowd. "How's Sofia's cough?" "Better," Elena lied, because the truth was too heavy to carry this early in the morning. She tied her apron around her waist and began the opening routine she could do in her sleep. Fill the coffee pots, check the condiment stations, make sure the pie case was stocked with the desserts that Martha Hendricks, Bill's wife, baked fresh every day. The first customers started trickling in around 6 a.m. Harold Peterson, who drove a delivery route for the bread company and always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and coffee black as his mood. Jenny Walsh, a nurse who worked the night shift at the county hospital and looked like she'd seen things that would give other people nightmares. Old Tom Morrison, a retired railroad worker who came in every day at 6:15 sharp and told the same stories about the old days when Millbrook was a stop on the cross-country line. Elena served them all with a smile that she'd perfected over years of practice, a smile that said, "I'm happy to be here," even when her feet already ached and she was calculating how many hours until she could see her children again. She poured coffee and took orders and wiped down tables, all while her mind ran through the mental arithmetic that consumed her waking hours. Rent was due in 12 days. Sofia needed new shoes. Miguel's teacher had sent home a note about a field trip that cost $15, which might as well have been $1,500. The morning rush was a blur of clinking plates and steaming mugs, of "Can I get you anything else?" and "How are you folks doing today?" Elena moved between tables like a dancer who'd memorized an intricate routine, never missing a step, never letting the performance falter. She'd learned that customers tipped better when the waitress seemed happy, when she remembered their names and asked about their families, when she made them feel like they were the most important people in her day. At 8:30 a.m., a man she'd never seen before walked through the diner's front door. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. His jeans were faded but clean, his boots were worn but well-maintained, and the hat was the kind that working men wore, not the costume version that city folks bought when they wanted to play cowboy for the weekend. He found an empty booth in Elena's section and sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body had been tested by hard work and come out stronger for it. "Coffee?" Elena asked, approaching his table with the pot in one hand and a menu in the other. "Please," he said, and his voice had a quality that made her look at him more carefully. It was deep and quiet, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. When she poured his coffee, she noticed his hands. They were large and calloused, with a thin white scar across the back of his left knuckles. Working hands. Honest hands. "I'll need a minute with the menu," he said, and Elena nodded and moved on to her other tables, but she found herself glancing back at him. There was something about the way he sat, perfectly still but completely alert, like a man who was used to watching and waiting. He didn't fidget with his phone like most people didn't drum his fingers on the table or look around impatiently. He just existed in his space with a kind of calm that Elena envied. When she returned 5 minutes later, he ordered the rancher's breakfast: 3 eggs, bacon, hash browns, and biscuits with gravy. It was the kind of meal that working men ate when they needed fuel for a long day, not the careful portions of someone counting calories or watching their cholesterol.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You passing through?" Elena asked as she refilled his coffee cup, making conversation the way she did with all the customers. "Depends," he said, looking up at her with eyes that were the color of storm clouds. "Looking at some property outside town. Might stick around if it works out." Elena nodded and moved on, but throughout the morning, she found herself paying attention to him in a way that surprised her. He ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who had time and wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He read a local newspaper that someone had left behind, turning the pages with careful attention as if the Millbrook Gazette contained world-changing news instead of high school sports scores and announcements about church big sales. When he finished his breakfast, he left a $10 tip on a $12 meal, which was either incredibly generous or a mistake. Elena approached the table cautiously, holding the money. "I think you might have left too much," she said, because in her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. He smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face completely. "No mistake. Coffee was perfect, food was better, and the service was the kind that makes a man want to come back." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she couldn't remember the last time someone's words had affected her that way. "Thank you," she managed, tucking the money into her apron pocket where it felt warm against her hip. "I'm David, by the way," he said, standing and placing his hat on his head with the easy motion of someone who'd been wearing hats his whole life. "David Coleman." "Elena," she replied, because it seemed important to give him her name, though she wasn't sure why. "Elena," he repeated, as if he was testing how it sounded. "That's a beautiful name." And then he was gone, walking out into the morning sunshine that streamed through the diner's windows and made everything look golden and possible. Elena watched him through the glass as he climbed into a pickup truck that was the same dusty blue as the sky before a thunderstorm. She stood there, longer than she should have, longer than was professional, until Jenny Walsh called for more coffee and pulled her back into the rhythm of the morning. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of routine tasks and wandering thoughts. Elena found herself thinking about David Coleman's smile, about the way he'd said her name like it meant something. She told herself it was foolish, that men like that didn't look twice at women like her, women who wore mended uniforms and counted every penny and had children to think about before they thought about themselves. At 2 p.m., Elena clocked out and hurried home to change clothes and check on her children. Mrs. Garcia, who lived in the apartment next door, watched Sofia and Miguel for free in exchange for Elena picking up her prescriptions and helping with her grocery shopping. It was an arrangement born of mutual necessity, 2 women helping each other survive in a world that seemed designed to make that as difficult as possible. Sofia was feeling better, her breathing easier in the afternoon air that came through the open windows. Miguel had finished his homework and was reading a library book about dinosaurs, his lips moving silently as he worked through the difficult words. Elena kissed them both and promised she'd be home by 6:30, which was a promise she intended to keep, but knew might be impossible depending on how busy the cleaning service was. Her second job was with Millbrook Commercial Cleaning, a company that had a contract to clean the offices in the small business district downtown. Elena worked there from 2:30 p.m. to 6 p.m., emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets and scrubbing toilets that belonged to people who made more in a month than she made in a year. It was honest work, but it was the kind of work that made you invisible, that reduced you to a function rather than a person. The worst part wasn't the physical labor, though her back ached constantly and her hands were raw from the cleaning chemicals. The worst part was the way people looked through her, as if she was part of the furniture they'd hired someone to dust,
lawyers and accountants and insurance agents who would step around her as she worked, discussing their lunch plans or their weekend golf games while she cleaned up the messes they left behind. Elena had learned to find dignity in the work itself, in the satisfaction of leaving a space cleaner than she'd found it, in the knowledge that she was providing for her children through her own effort rather than depending on charity or handouts. But there were days when the invisibility felt like a weight on her chest, when she wanted to stand up and remind them that she had a name and dreams and children who thought she hung the moon. Today wasn't one of those days. Today, her mind kept drifting back to storm cloud eyes and the way a stranger had said her name like it meant something. She found herself humming while she worked, an old song her grandmother used to sing while she cooked, and the other women on the cleaning crew noticed. "You're cheerful today," observed Carmen Santos, who had been working for the cleaning service for 8 years and had perfected the art of doing the minimum required work in the maximum allowable time. "Something good happen?" "Just a good day," Elena replied, because she wasn't ready to put words to whatever had shifted in her chest during that brief conversation at the diner. She finished her cleaning route at exactly 6 p.m. and hurried home to spend 30 minutes with her children before leaving for her third job. This was the hardest part of her day, the transition between being Elena the worker and Elena the mother, the woman who had to be everything to everyone and somehow found the energy to keep going. Sofia and Miguel were waiting for her with drawings they'd made, crayon masterpieces that Elena would add to the collection covering their refrigerator. Sofia had drawn a house with a garden and a dog, her 5-year-old's vision of what home should look like. Miguel had drawn a family standing in front of a house, 4 stick figures holding hands under a sun that took up half the page. "Who's the 4th person?" Elena asked, pointing to the figure that stood beside her and the 2 smaller ones that represented him and Sofia. Miguel shrugged, with the casual wisdom of childhood, "Just somebody who belongs with us." Elena felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been heartbreak. She kissed the top of his head and promised herself that someday, somehow, she would give them the life Miguel drew with his crayons, the life where there was enough room and enough time and enough love to go around. Her third job was at Rosie's Roadhouse, a bar and grill on the outskirts of town that catered to truckers and locals who wanted to drink beer and listen to country music and forget about whatever was troubling them. Elena worked there from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. on weekdays, serving drinks and dodging wandering hands and smiling even when her feet felt like they were on fire. The Roadhouse was everything the diner wasn't. Where the diner was bright and clean and family-friendly, the Roadhouse was dim and smoky and full of the kind of men who thought buying a woman a drink entitled her to her attention. Elena had learned to navigate this world with careful precision, friendly enough to earn good tips, but distant enough to avoid trouble. The owner, Rose Patterson, was a woman in her 50s who inherited the bar from her ex-husband and ran it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. She looked out for her female employees as much as she could, but there were limits to what she could control in a place where alcohol and loneliness mixed like gasoline and matches. "You're glowing today," Rose observed, as Elena tied her apron around her waist and checked her station. "Something I should know about?" Elena laughed, because the idea that she could be glowing after 16 hours of work seemed impossible. "Just tired, I think. Maybe I'm getting delirious." But as the evening wore on, Elena found herself thinking about David Coleman again. She wondered what kind of property he was looking at, whether he would actually stay in Millbrook or move on like so many people did when they realized that small-town life wasn't as romantic as it looked in movies. She wondered if he was married, if he had children, if he was the kind of man who would understand that a woman with 2 kids and 3 jobs didn't have time for complications.
The night crowd at the Roadhouse was the usual mix of regulars and strangers, men who worked construction or drove trucks or farmed the land that stretched for miles outside of town. They drank beer and played pool and told stories that got bigger with each telling, and Elena moved among them like a ghost, taking orders and clearing tables and counting the tips that would help pay for Sofia's medicine. It was nearly midnight when David Coleman walked through the door. Elena was wiping down the bar when she saw him, and for a moment she thought she might be hallucinating from exhaustion.
He looked different in the dim light of the roadhouse, more serious somehow, and she wondered what had brought him to a place like this so late at night. He found an empty stool at the far end of the bar and sat down with the same careful stillness she'd noticed at the diner. When Elena approached, he smiled the same smile that had made her stomach flutter 12 hours earlier. "Small town," he said by way of greeting. "Very small," Elena agreed, pulling a beer from the cooler without being asked, because she somehow knew that's what he wanted. "How did the property viewing go?" "Good. Better than good, actually." He took a sip of his beer and studied her face in the mirror behind the bar. "You work a lot." It wasn't a question, and Elena felt suddenly self-conscious about being seen here, about him knowing that she needed 3 jobs to make ends meet. "Bills don't pay themselves," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "No, they don't," David agreed, and there was something in his tone that made her think he understood about bills and responsibility and doing whatever it took to survive. The bar was busy enough that Elena couldn't linger, but she found herself gravitating back to David's end of the bar whenever she had a free moment. He didn't try to flirt with her like the other customers sometimes didn't make jokes about her working late or offer to buy her a drink when her shift ended. He just sat there, drinking his beer slowly and watching the room with those storm cloud eyes. And somehow his presence made the night feel less difficult. At 1:30 a.m., when the bar was starting to empty and Elena was beginning the process of cleaning up, David finished his beer and left money on the bar. Again, it was more than necessary, and again Elena felt compelled to say something. "You don't have to tip like that," she said, because part of her was embarrassed by her need for his generosity. "I want to," he said simply. "You work hard. You should be appreciated for it." Elena felt tears threaten behind her eyes, and she turned away to collect herself. When she turned back, David was putting on his hat. "I'll be back," he said, and it sounded like a promise. "For breakfast, I mean, at the diner." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She watched him leave, watched him walk out into the night that would be dawn in just a few hours, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt seen. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. Elena cleaned tables and counted her tips and helped Rose close down the bar, all while her mind spun with questions and possibilities and fears. By the time she walked home through the empty streets of Millbrook, the sky was already beginning to lighten in the east, and she could hear the birds starting to sing in the trees that lined Main Street. She climbed the stairs to her apartment as quietly as she could, checking on her children who slept the deep sleep of the innocent and exhausted. Sofia's breathing was easier, Miguel's face was peaceful, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. She fell into bed with her clothes still on, too tired to change, too wired to sleep immediately. Her body ached in ways that had become familiar, but there was something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. In 3 hours, her alarm clock would ring again, and she would begin another day that looked exactly like this one. Except maybe it wouldn't, because maybe David Coleman would come back for breakfast. And maybe when he smiled at her and said her name, she would find the courage to smile back in a way that meant something. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her children breathing, to the early morning sounds of Millbrook waking up outside her window. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, and she thought about houses with gardens and families that fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the 4th person in Miguel's drawing wasn't just wishful thinking. The alarm clock's shrill cry was still 3 hours away, but Elena Martinez fell asleep with a smile on her face, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she dreamed of something other than surviving until tomorrow. David Coleman returned to Sunrise Diner the next morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., settling into the same booth he'd occupied the day before. Elena noticed him immediately, despite the morning rush that had her moving between tables like a woman possessed. Her heart did something irregular when she saw him, a skip that made her pause in the middle of pouring coffee to Harold Peterson. "You all right there, Elena?" Harold asked, raising an eyebrow as she stood frozen with the coffee pot halfway to his cup. Fine, sorry," she managed, completing the pour and moving on to her other tables. But her awareness of David was like a magnet pulling at the edge of her vision, making her hyper-conscious of every movement, every word, every breath. When she finally approached his table, David looked up from the local newspaper he'd been reading, that same transformative smile spreading across his weathered features. "Good morning, Elena." The way he said her name, like he'd been practicing it, made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Morning. Coffee? Please." He watched her pour, and she was grateful for the familiar routine that kept her hand steady. "Sleep well?" The question was casual, polite, but something in his tone suggested genuine interest. Elena almost laughed, thinking of the 3 hours of rest she'd managed between jobs, the way her body had protested when the alarm screamed its daily wake-up call. "Well enough," she said, which was truthful in its own way. She had slept well, better than she had in months, and I suspect it had something to do with the man sitting across from her. "The rancher's breakfast again?" she asked, pen poised over her order pad. "Actually," David said, closing the newspaper and giving her his full attention, "I was hoping you might recommend something. I'm new to town, don't know the specialties yet." Elena found herself smiling without thinking about it. "Well, Martha makes the best blueberry pancakes this side of the county line. And Bill's hash browns are famous locally, though I'm not sure that's saying much in a town like this." "Blueberry pancakes it is. And hash browns."
Can't argue with local fame. As Elena wrote down his order, she felt him watching her, not in the uncomfortable way that some men did, but with a kind of quiet attention that made her feel seen rather than scrutinized. When she looked up, she caught him studging her hands, which were chapped from the cleaning chemicals and showed the small cuts and burns that came from years of service work. "You have strong hands," he said, and the observation was so unexpected that Elena blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "Your hands. They tell a story about someone who works hard, takes care of things. My grandmother had hands like that." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "She used to say that a person's hands showed their character better than their words ever could." Elena looked down at her own hands, seeing them through his eyes. The short nails filed down to prevent scratches, the calluses from carrying heavy trays, the scar across her thumb from when Sofia had been teething and knocked a glass out of her hand. She'd always thought of them as just tools, necessary parts of getting through each day. "I should get this order in," she said, suddenly shy under his scrutiny. "Of course, I don't want to keep you from your work." But as Elena moved through the diner, taking orders and refilling coffee cups, she found herself thinking about what David had said. Character in hands. Stories written in scars and calluses. It was a different way of seeing herself, one that felt almost revolutionary. When she brought David his breakfast, he was looking out the window at the main street of Millbrook, watching the town wait up, a postal worker making his rounds, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, children walking to school with backpacks that looked too big for their small frames. "Quiet place," he observed, as Elena set down his plate. "Quiet place," he observed, as Elena set down his plate. "Some people would say too quiet," Elena replied, following his gaze. "Most folks who grow up here can't wait to leave for somewhere more exciting." "What about you? You grow up here?" Elena shook her head. "Texas originally, El Paso. Moved here about 2 years ago." "What brought you to Millbrook?" The question was gentle, but Elena sensed it was important to him somehow. She hesitated because the real answer was complicated and painful and not the kind of thing you shared with a near stranger over breakfast. "Fresh start," she said finally, which was true enough. David nodded as if he understood the weight of those 2 words. Fresh starts are valuable things, not always easy to come by. There was something in his voice that made Elena look at him more carefully. "Sounds like you know something about that." "Some,"
he admitted, cutting into his pancakes. "These are incredible, by the way. Your Martha knows her way around a griddle." Elena smiled, pleased by his obvious enjoyment of the food. "She'll be happy to hear that. Been making those pancakes the same way for 23 years. Consistency is underrated. Knowing what you can count on, day after day, that's worth something." Elena was called away to handle another table, but his words stayed with her. Consistency. Reliability. Things she'd been trying to provide for her children despite circumstances that seemed designed to make consistency impossible. She wondered if David understood how hard it was to be reliable when the world kept shifting under your feet. The morning passed quickly, and before Elena knew it, David was finishing his coffee and reaching for his wallet. Again, he left a generous tip, and again Elena felt compelled to say something. "You know, if you keep tipping like this, people are going to think you're trying to buy something," she said, attempting to make a joke of her discomfort. David's expression grew serious. "Maybe I am trying to buy something. Maybe I'm trying to buy a few minutes of conversation with someone who seems worth talking to." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm just a waitress." "No," David said firmly, standing and placing his hat on his head. "You're a woman raising 2 children while working 3 jobs and still managing to smile at strangers. That's not just anything." He knew about her children. Elena's mouth opened in surprise, but before she could ask how he knew, David was speaking again. "Mrs. Garcia mentioned them yesterday when I was looking at the apartment upstairs from the bakery. Said you were the hardest-working mother she'd ever seen." "You're looking at the apartment?" Elena's voice came out higher than she intended. Looked at it, decided against it.
Too small for what I have in mind. David adjusted his hat, a gesture Eleanor was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking. "I'll see you tonight." "Tonight? At the Roadhouse, if that's all right?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him leave. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of speculation and anticipation. David knew about her children, knew about her 3 jobs, and somehow that knowledge hadn't sent him running. If anything, it seemed to have drawn him closer. When Eleanor got home that afternoon, she found Sofia coloring at the kitchen table while Miguel read to her from one of his library books. The sight of them together, heads bent over the picture book, made her heart swell with the fierce love that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. "Mama!" Sofia launched herself from her chair and wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist. "Miguel taught me a new word, brontosaurus." "That's a big word for a little girl," Eleanor said, lifting Sofia onto her hip and kissing the top of her head. "It's a big dinosaur," Sofia explained seriously, "bigger than our whole apartment." Miguel looked up from his book, his 8-year-old face already showing the thoughtfulness that reminded Eleanor so much of his father. "How was work today, Mama?" "Good," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Really good. That evening, Eleanor found herself taking extra care with her appearance before heading to the Roadhouse. She brushed her hair until it shone, chose her cleanest shirt, even applied a little lip gloss she'd been saving for special occasions. Mrs. Garcia raised an eyebrow when she saw Eleanor heading out. "You look nice tonight, mija. Something I should know about?" Eleanor felt herself blushing again. "Just trying to make a good impression." "On anyone in particular?" "Maybe," Eleanor admitted, and Mrs. Garcia's knowing smile followed her down the stairs. The Roadhouse was busy when Eleanor arrived, Friday night bringing out the workers who wanted to drink away the week's frustrations. Rose was behind the bar, her silver hair pinned up and her sharp eyes missing nothing as she surveyed her domain. "You're practically glowing," Rose observed as Eleanor tied on her apron. "Should I be worried about you getting distracted tonight?" "I'll do my job," Eleanor said, but she couldn't keep the smile off her face. David arrived at 9:30, finding the same stool at the end of the bar he'd occupied the night before. Eleanor served him a beer and tried to appear casual, but her awareness of him was like electricity in the air. "Busy night," he observed, nodding toward the crowded pool tables and the couples swaying to the jukebox music. "Friday nights usually are. People like to blow off steam after a long week." "What about you? How do you blow off steam?" Eleanor laughed, a sound that was more tired than amused. When do I have time to blow off steam? David studied her face in the mirror behind the bar. Everyone needs downtime, Eleanor. Everyone needs something that's just for them. I have my children. They're enough. They're wonderful, I'm sure. But what about you? What makes Eleanor happy, separate from being a mother? The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked what she wanted, what she needed, what brought her joy independent of her role as provider and protector. Eleanor found herself thinking, really thinking, about the last time she'd done something purely for herself. "I used to love to dance," she said finally, the words coming out almost without her permission. "Before the kids, before everything got so complicated, I used to go out dancing with my friends, stay out until the sun came up." What kind of dancing? Everything. Salsa, country, whatever the music called for. Eleanor smiled at the memory. I was good at it too. Had rhythm, my grandmother always said. David glanced toward the small dance floor where two couples were moving slowly to a Patsy Cline song. "Dance with me." Eleanor's hand stilled on the glass she was wiping. "I'm working." One song. When things slowed down a bit.
I don't think Rose would approve. David looked around the bar, assessing the crowd. What if Rose approved? Would you dance with me then? Before Elena could answer, Rose appeared beside them, as if summoned by the mention of her name. What's this about dancing? Elena felt her cheeks burn. Nothing, Rose, we were just talking. I was asking Elena to dance, David said calmly, wondering if you might spare her for one song. Rose looked from David to Elena, taking in Elena's flushed face and bright eyes. You know how to lead? Yes, ma'am. And you won't get my girl in trouble with the other customers? Won't make them think she's available for more than serving drinks? No, ma'am. Just one dance, respectful and proper. Rose considered for a moment, then nodded. One song, when the rush dies down. And, Elena, if any of the regulars give you grief about it, you send them to me. An hour later, when the crowd had thinned and the music had shifted to something slow and sweet, David stood and extended his hand to Elena. Shall we? Elena looked around the bar, suddenly nervous. Dancing with a customer was crossing a line she'd never crossed before, stepping into territory that felt dangerous and exciting. I might be rusty, she warned as she untied her apron. We'll start slow. David led her to the small dance floor, his hand warm and steady in hers. When he pulled her into his arms, Elena was surprised by how natural it felt, how easily she fell into the rhythm of moving with another person. He was a good dancer, confident without being showy, leading her through simple steps that gradually became more complex as her confidence returned. You weren't kidding, David murmured as they swayed to the music. You do have rhythm. Elena found herself relaxing in his arms, letting the music carry her away from the bar and the customers and the constant worry that was her usual companion. For the first time in years, she was just Elena, not Elena the waitress, or Elena the mother, or Elena the woman who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. She was just a woman dancing with a man who made her feel graceful and desirable and worth pursuing. When the song ended, they stood still for a moment, her hand in his other hand resting on the small of her back. The bar around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of possibility. Thank you, Elena said softly. Thank you for trusting me, David replied. They returned to their respective places, Elena behind the bar and David on his stool, but something had shifted between them. The air felt charged with potential, with the promise of something neither of them had named yet. For the rest of the evening, their conversations were deeper, more personal. David told her about the ranch he was considering buying, 500 acres of rolling hills and good pasture land about 15 minutes outside of town. Elena told him about her children's personalities, how Sofia was fearless and creative, while Miguel was thoughtful and protective. They sound wonderful, David said when Elena finished describing Miguel's latest dinosaur fascination. They are. They're everything to me.
I can see that. The way you talk about them, the love in your voice, they're lucky to have you. Elena felt tears threaten, because it had been so long since anyone had told her she was a good mother. So long since anyone had seen the love instead of just the struggle. Some days I wonder if I'm enough for them. If working so much means I'm missing too much of their lives. You're providing for them, David said firmly. You're showing them what it means to be strong, to never give up. That's not missing their lives. That's teaching them how to live. When the bar closed at 2 a.m., David walked Elena to her car, an old Honda that had seen better decades but still got her where she needed to go. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. "Elena," David said as she unlocked her car door, "I want to ask you something, but I don't want you to feel pressured to answer tonight." Elena turned to face him, her heart beating faster. "Okay. I'd like to take you to dinner. Somewhere nice, not the diner or the roadhouse. A real date, with you dressed up and me trying to impress you." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I know your situation is complicated, with the kids and the jobs and everything, but I think there might be something here worth exploring."
"It's not just about logistics," Elena said, though her resolve was weakening under the intensity of his gaze. "I don't have a dress for a nice restaurant. I don't remember how to be anything other than a mother and a worker." David stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and masculine that made her think of wide-open spaces. "Elena, you're already so much more than you give yourself credit for. You're intelligent and kind and beautiful and strong. Any man would be lucky to take you to dinner." "You don't really know me," Elena protested weakly. "I know enough. I know you work 3 jobs to provide for your children. I know you smile even when you're exhausted. I know you dance like an angel and tip your chin up when you're trying to be brave." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I know I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday morning." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, some walls she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of hope. "David, think about it," he said, stepping back and giving her space. "That's all I'm asking. Think about whether you might want to try something new, something just for you." Elena drove home through the empty streets of Millbrook with David's words echoing in her mind. Something just for you. When was the last time she'd had something that was purely hers, not connected to survival or responsibility or the needs of others? She climbed the stairs to her apartment quietly, checking on her sleeping children before collapsing into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the way it felt to be held while dancing, the way David had looked at her like she was something precious and rare. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to be Elena the woman, as well as Elena the mother. Maybe there was room in her life for something beautiful and unexpected. Maybe David Coleman was the answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to pray. The next morning brought Saturday, which meant Elena only had to work at the diner until 2 p.m. It was her one partial day off, the closest thing to rest she allowed herself in her relentless schedule. She woke to find Sofia and Miguel already awake, playing quietly in their beds so as not to disturb her. "Good morning, my loves," she said, stretching muscles that protested the previous night's activities. "Mama, can we go to the park today?" Sofia asked hopefully. "Miguel said maybe we could have a picnic." Elena's first instinct was to calculate the cost of a picnic, to worry about the time it would take, to think of all the reasons why it wasn't practical. But then she thought about David's question. What makes Elena happy? "You know what?" she said, surprising herself. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea." The joy on her children's faces was worth more than any tip she'd ever received. Elena got ready for her shift at the diner on Monday morning, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, elderly, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and wearing a floral dress that spoke of someone who still believed in dressing up for public appearances. They were deep in conversation when Elena approached their table, and she hesitated, suddenly uncertain about interrupting. David looked up and smiled, that same warm expression that had been haunting her thoughts all weekend. "Elena, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet someone special." He gestured to the woman. "This is my aunt, Margaret Coleman. Aunt Maggie, this is Elena Martinez, the woman I've been telling you about. Margaret Coleman extended her hand with a firm grip and kind eyes that reminded her of her own grandmother. David has mentioned you quite a bit, dear. It's lovely to finally meet you. Elena shook her hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed. David had been talking about her to his family. Nice to meet you two, Mrs. Coleman. Just Maggie, please. I'm far too old for formalities. Margaret's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that put Elena at ease. David tells me you have two little ones. Yes, Sofia and Miguel, 5 and 8. Wonderful ages. David was about Miguel's age when he came to live with me. Margaret glanced fondly at her nephew. His parents died in a car accident, and he spent his growing up years on my ranch in Colorado. Best thing that ever happened to both of us, if I'm being honest. Elena looked at David with new understanding.
He knew about loss, about starting over, about the fragility of family. No wonder he seemed to understand her situation so well. "Coffee?" Elena asked, falling back on the familiar routine of work to steady herself. "Please," David said, "and Aunt Maggie would love to try those famous blueberry pancakes." As Elena poured their coffee, Margaret studied her with the frank assessment of someone who had lived long enough to read people quickly and accurately. "David tells me you're quite the worker. 3 jobs, is that right?" Elena nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "It's what I need to do right now." "Admirable. I raised David on the belief that hard work builds character. Looks like you're building plenty of it." Margaret's tone was approving rather than pitying, which Elena appreciated. "He also tells me you might be interested in seeing his new place." Elena glanced at David, who was watching her carefully. "Your new place?" "I bought the ranch," David said quietly. "Signed the papers Friday afternoon. 500 acres, main house, guest cottage, good barn, and plenty of room for horses." "Congratulations," Elena said, though something in her chest felt heavy. If David had bought property, he was staying in Millbrook permanently. That should have made her happy, but instead it made everything feel more complicated, more real. "The house needs work," Margaret continued, seemingly oblivious to Elena's internal struggle. "Hasn't had a woman's touch in years. David's got good intentions, but men don't always see what needs doing." Elena took their order and moved on to her other tables, but their conversation had unsettled her. She'd spent the weekend convincing herself that saying yes to David's dinner invitation was just about one evening, one chance to feel like a woman instead of just a mother and worker. But buying a ranch suggested permanence, suggested a man who was thinking beyond casual dating. When she returned with their food, Margaret was showing David something on her phone, their heads bent together in concentration. "That's the one," she was saying. "She'd be perfect for what you have in mind." "Perfect for what?" Elena asked, before she could stop herself. David looked up, his expression slightly embarrassed. "Aunt Maggie's helping me find a horse. I haven't ridden in years, but you can't have a ranch without at least one good horse." "David was quite the rider as a boy," Margaret said proudly. "Won several competitions at the county fair. Had a natural seat, natural hands." Elena tried to picture David on horseback and found the image came easily. He had the build for it, the quiet confidence that horses would respond to. "What kind of horse are you looking for?" "Something gentle but spirited. A horse that could teach children to ride eventually." David's eyes met hers across the table. "I've always thought kids should grow up around animals if possible. Teaches responsibility, compassion." The conversation continued throughout their meal, with Margaret regaling Elena with stories of David's childhood on the ranch, his academic success despite having to work alongside his studies, his brief stint in the military before returning to help her manage the property. Elena found herself drawn into their easy dynamic, the way they teased each other with obvious affection. David was always bringing home strays. Injured birds, abandoned kittens, once even a baby deer that had lost its mother. Drove me half crazy with worry, but he had such a tender heart for creatures that needed help.
Elena glanced at David, who was clearly embarrassed by his aunt's stories. Did they all survive? Most of them. David has good instincts about healing, about what broken things need to mend. Margaret's eyes met Elena's with unmistakable meaning. Still does, I think. When they finished breakfast, Margaret announced she needed to visit the local feed store to check their grain prices. David, why don't you show Elena around town? I'll meet you back at the hotel in a couple hours. I have to finish my shift, Elena protested, but Bill Hendricks appeared as if on cue. Elena, why don't you take the rest of the morning off? Martha and I can handle the lunch crowd. Elena looked between Bill and David, suspecting conspiracy. I need the hours, Bill. Consider it paid time off. Call it a bonus for all the extra shifts you've covered. Before Elena could protest further, she found herself walking down Main Street with David, the morning sun warming her face and the familiar weight of work temporarily lifted from her shoulders. They moved slowly, David pointing out buildings and asking about the town's history, but Elena could sense he had something on his mind. Your aunt seems lovely, Elena said, as they paused in front of the old courthouse. She is. Practically raised me single-handed after my parents died. Taught me everything I know about ranching, about life in general. She's very proud of you. David nodded, his expression growing serious. Elena, I need to tell you something about why I'm really here in Millbrook. Elena's stomach tightened. Okay. I didn't just randomly decide to buy a ranch here. I've been looking for the right place for over a year, somewhere to start something new. When I found the property here, I thought it was perfect. Good land, fair price, close enough to Denver for supplies, but far enough away to have real peace. They continued walking as David spoke, his hands clasped behind his back, and a gesture Elena was learning meant he was choosing his words carefully. But then I met you, and everything changed. Suddenly it wasn't just about the land or the house or starting over. It was about the possibility of starting over with someone. Elena stopped walking. David, I told you my situation is complicated. I know, and I'm not asking you to uncomplicate it. I'm asking if you might want to complicate it differently. What does that mean? David turned to face her fully, his storm cloud eyes serious. It means I have a proposition for you. Hear me out before you say anything, okay? Elena nodded, though her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. I need help getting the ranch ready. The house needs cleaning, organizing, decorating. The gardens are overgrown. There's meal planning and cooking for the crew I'll need to hire. It's a lot of work, more than I can handle alone. David, if you're offering me another job, I'm offering you one job instead of 3. I'm offering you a place to live where your children can have their own rooms, where Sofia can run around outside without you worrying about traffic, where Miguel can have a dog if he wants one. Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You want me to be your housekeeper? I want you to be my partner, in the ranch, in building something together. I want Sofia and Miguel to have stability, security, a chance to be kids instead of tiny adults who worry about their mother working herself to death. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. You think I'm working myself to death? I think you're the strongest woman I've ever met, but even strong women need help sometimes. Even strong women deserve to have someone take care of them for a change. Elena felt tears threatening and turned away, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what David was suggesting. You barely know me. You don't know anything about my past, about why I ended up here. Then tell me. The simple words hung between them, an invitation and a challenge. Elena had spent 2 years keeping her secrets, protecting her privacy, maintaining the fiction that she'd come to Millbrook for vague reasons of wanting a fresh start. But standing on the sidewalk, with David looking at her with such patient understanding, she found herself wanting to tell the truth. Sofia and Miguel's father was killed in Afghanistan when I was pregnant with the twins. I was 23 years old.
alone, with no family support and no idea how to survive. The words came slowly at first, then faster as she gained momentum. Sofia and Miguel's stepfather when she was 2, Marcus. He seemed kind at first, stable. He had a good job, said he wanted to take care of us all. It took 6 months for him to show his true nature. He was controlling, possessive. He didn't want me working, didn't want me having friends, didn't even want me talking to neighbors. When I tried to leave the first time, he threatened to have the children taken away, said no court would give custody to an unemployed widow with no resources. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. He never hit me, but he didn't need to. Financial abuse is just as effective. He controlled every penny, monitored every purchase. I had to ask permission to buy groceries. How did you get away? David's voice was gentle, encouraging. Marcus had a heart attack 2 years ago. Massive coronary at 35. The doctor said it was probably stress related to his job, but I think it was all that anger he carried around. It had to go somewhere. Elena took a shaky breath. After he died, I found out he'd been hiding debts, gambling problems.
There was nothing left. The house, the cars, everything was gone. So I packed what we could carry and came here, because it was far enough away from El Paso that no one would know our story. David was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. I'm sorry you went through that. No one should have to live that way. The point is, I've been on my own for 2 years now, and I've managed. My children are fed and clothed and safe. We might not have much, but what we have is ours. And you're afraid that accepting help means giving up that independence? Elena nodded, grateful that he understood. I can't go back to being dependent on someone else's decisions, someone else's moods. I won't put my children in that position again. David stepped closer, his voice earnest. Elena, what I'm offering isn't dependence, it's partnership. You'd have your own income, your own space, your own choices. The ranch would be as much yours as mine if you wanted it to be. How can you say that? You don't know if I can even manage a household, let alone help run a ranch. I know you manage 3 jobs and 2 children with grace and determination. I know you're intelligent and resourceful and hardworking. I know Sofia and Miguel are polite, well-behaved kids who clearly adore their mother. David's expression grew tender. And I know that in 2 days, you've made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond just existing. Elena felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart. David, what if it doesn't work? What if we try this and it's a disaster? My children have been through enough upheaval. Then we figure it out together. But Elena, what if it does work? What if Sofia gets to grow up on a ranch with horses and open sky? What if Miguel gets to learn about responsibility by caring for animals instead of worrying about his mother? What if you get to discover who Elena is when she's not constantly fighting just to survive? The picture David painted was so beautiful, so tempting, that Elena felt dizzy with the possibility of it. A home instead of an apartment, stability instead of constant struggle, partnership instead of isolation. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. But Elena, while you're thinking, remember that you deserve happiness. You deserve help. You deserve someone who sees your worth and wants to build something beautiful with you. They walked back to the diner in comfortable silence, Elena's mind spinning with everything David had offered. When they reached her car, he stopped and turned to her. The dinner invitation still stands, too. Regardless of what you decide about the ranch, I'd still like to take you out, to show you that you're worth celebrating. Elena looked at this man who had walked into her life like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. Okay. Okay to dinner? Okay to dinner. And okay to thinking about the rest of it. David's smile could power the entire town. That's all I can ask for. As Elena drove home, she thought about Sofia's drawing of a house with a garden, about Miguel's picture of a family with 4 people holding hands. Maybe her son had been more prophetic than she'd realized.
Maybe the fourth person in their family portrait wasn't just wishful thinking. Maybe David Coleman was the answer to questions she hadn't known how to ask. That evening, after she had put the children to bed and sat down with a cup of tea, Elena called the number David had written on a napkin. He answered on the first ring. "Elena?" "Hi. I've been thinking about what you said today." "And?" "I think I'd like to see the ranch. Before I make any decisions, I'd like to see what you're offering." "Of course. When works for you?" "Tomorrow's my day off. Could we go tomorrow?" "I'll pick you up at 10. Elena hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of her small apartment, listening to her children breathe in the next room.
Tomorrow, she would see David's ranch, would stand on the land where he was imagining their future together. Tomorrow, she would decide whether to take the biggest leap of faith of her life. For tonight, she allowed herself to dream of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. A home where her children could run free. A partnership built on respect instead of control. A chance to discover who Elena Martinez could be when she wasn't just surviving, but actually living. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like stars, and Elena made a wish on every single one of them. The gravel road crunched under the tires of David's pickup truck as they approached the ranch gates. Elena pressed her face to the passenger window, watching the landscape transform from suburban streets to rolling hills dotted with oak trees. Sofia and Miguel sat in the back seat, their eyes wide with wonder at the endless expanse of green pastures stretching toward distant mountains. "Are we almost there?" Sofia asked, bouncing in her seat with excitement. "Just over that rise," David answered, glancing at Elena with barely contained anticipation. When the house came into view, Elena's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a mansion or anything grand, but it was substantial and welcoming, with wraparound porch and dormer windows that looked out over the valley. The white paint was fresh, the roof was solid, and flower beds flanked the front steps, though they were currently overrun with weeds. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, and she meant it. This wasn't just a house. It was a home waiting to happen. David parked near the front steps and came around to open Elena's door, a gesture of courtesy that still surprised her after years of opening her own doors. Miguel and Sofia tumbled out of the back seat like puppies let loose in a new yard, immediately running toward a massive tire swing hanging from an old elm tree. "Careful!" Elena called automatically, but David placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Let them explore. The yard is fenced, and there's nothing dangerous." Elena watched her children discover the joy of space, of being able to run without bumping into walls or worrying about disturbing neighbors. Miguel had found a stick and was poking at something in the grass, while Sofia attempted to climb onto the tire swing with determination that far exceeded her coordination. "Come on," David said, taking Elena's hand. "Let me show you the inside." The front door opened into a spacious living room with hardwood floors and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The furniture was sparse but well made, clearly chosen by someone who valued quality over quantity. Large windows let in streams of golden afternoon light, and Elena could see clear through to the kitchen at the back of the house. 5 bedrooms upstairs, David explained as they walked through the rooms. Master suite, guest room, and 3 smaller bedrooms that would be perfect for children. Each one has its own window seat. Elena tried to maintain her composure, but her heart was racing as she imagined Sofia and Miguel each having their own space, their own windows to look out at the world beyond. In their current apartment, privacy was a luxury none of them could afford. The kitchen made her gasp audibly. It was a cook's dream, with granite countertops, a farmhouse sink, and a gas range that looked like it could handle preparing meals for an army. A breakfast nook by the window had built-in bench seating and a view of the backyard, where her children were now attempting to push each other on the tire swing. The previous owners renovated before they decided to move to Florida. All the appliances are new, plumbing and electrical updated. The bones of the house are solid. "It's incredible," Elena said, running her fingers along the smooth countertops. She could picture herself here, preparing real meals, instead of grabbing whatever was quick and cheap. She could see Sofia helping her bake cookies, Miguel doing homework at the kitchen table while she cooked dinner. David led her through the rest of the house, pointing out the mudroom with its built-in cubbies, perfect for storing school backpacks and coats, the pantry that was larger than her current bedroom, the office space that could double as a homework station. Every room seemed designed with family life in mind, with the kind of thoughtful details that made daily life easier and more pleasant. Upstairs, Elena stood in the doorway of what would be Sofia's room, watching sunlight dance across the polished floors. The window seat was topped with cushions and a cheerful yellow fabric, and she could imagine her daughter curled up there with a book or a coloring pad. "This room has the best morning light," David said quietly. "Perfect for a little girl who likes to wake up early." They moved to the next room, slightly larger, with built-in shelves that would be perfect for Miguel's growing collection of library books. The window looked out over the pasture where David planned to keep horses, and Elena could picture her son watching the animals from this perch, learning their habits and personalities. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall, spacious and serene with its own bathroom and a walk-in closet that was larger than the children's current bedroom. Elena tried not to think too hard about the implications of seeing this room, about what David might be hoping for their future. "There's something else I want to show you," David said as they headed back downstairs. He led her through the kitchen to a door she hadn't noticed before. It opened onto a screened-in porch that stretched across the back of the house, furnished with comfortable chairs and a dining table that could seat 8. Beyond the porch, the backyard sloped gently to a small barn and several outbuildings. "This is where I picture us having dinner on summer evenings, where the kids could do homework while you and I planned the next day's work, where we could sit after they're in bed and just talk." Elena sank into one of the chairs, overwhelmed by the completeness of the vision David was painting. He'd thought of everything, considered every detail of how their lives might interweave with this place. "David, this is all so beautiful, but I need to ask the practical questions. How would this actually work? What would my responsibilities be? What would you expect from me?" David sat across from her, his expression growing serious. "Fair questions. Here's what I'm thinking. You'd be in charge of the household management, meal planning, grocery shopping, keeping the house clean and organized. Eventually, when we hire ranch hands, you'd handle their meals too. That's probably a 40-hour-a-week job right there."
Elena nodded, appreciating his directness. "In exchange, you and the children would live here rent-free. I'd cover utilities, groceries, household expenses. You'd have your own bank account with a salary that's yours to use however you want. No questions asked, no permission needed." "What about the children? School, medical care?" "Millbrook Elementary is actually better than the school district where you're living now. Smaller classes, more individual attention. And the ranch comes with excellent health insurance that would cover all 3 of you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Health insurance? Sofia could see a specialist about her breathing problems. Miguel could get his eyes checked like his teacher had recommended. She could go to a doctor herself for the first time in 2 years. "There's more," David continued. "I've been thinking about this carefully. After a year, if things are working out for all of us, I'd like to put the ranch in both our names. Equal partnership, legal and financial." "David, that's too much. You can't just give someone you've known for a week half of a ranch." "I'm not giving you anything. I'm offering you the chance to earn it, to build something together." "Elena, I've been thinking about this property for months, planning how to make it work, but every plan I made felt incomplete until I met you." Through the screen, they could hear Sofia's delighted laughter as Miguel pushed her higher on the tire swing. The sound seemed to settle something in Elena's chest, some knot of tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "What if it doesn't work between us romantically?" Elena asked quietly. "What if we're better as friends than as partners?" David was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we figure that out as we go. The offer stands either way, Elena. I need help with this place, and your children need stability. Whether we end up together romantically or just as family by choice, I think we could build something good here." Elena stood and walked to the screen door, looking out at her children, who were now exploring the barn with the fearless curiosity of kids who'd never had space to roam.
They looked so free, so happy, so different from the careful, quiet children they had to be in their cramped apartment. My grandmother used to say that some opportunities only come once, Elena said, still watching Sofia and Miguel. She said the trick was recognizing them when they appeared. Smart woman. Elena turned back to David, this man who had walked into her life like an answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to voice. I have conditions. Name them. First, I want a trial period. 3 months where either of us can change our minds without penalty. If it doesn't work out, you help me find another place in town and give me time to get back on my feet. Agreed. Second, I need my own transportation. I can't be dependent on you for every errand or emergency. There's a truck that comes with the ranch. Previous owners left behind. It's yours. Third, Sofia and Miguel's bedtime routine, their rules, their discipline, that stays with me. You can have input if we end up together long term, but initially, parenting decisions are mine. Absolutely. Elena took a deep breath, feeling as though she was about to step off a cliff into open air. And fourth, I need you to understand that I'm scared. Terrified, actually. The last time I trusted someone with my children's security, it went badly. I need you to be patient with me, to understand that trust is something I'll have to learn again. David stood and walked to where she stood by the door. Elena, I would never ask you to trust me blindly. I want to earn it, day by day, choice by choice. I want to prove to you that not all men are like Marcus, that partnership doesn't have to mean losing yourself. What if I'm not good at this? What if I can't be the partner you need? What if you're exactly what I need? What if Sofia and Miguel are exactly what this place needs to become a real home? David's voice was gentle but certain. Elena, I've been alone for a long time. I know what empty feels like. This past week, watching you with your children, talking with you, seeing how hard you work and how much you love, that's not empty. That's the opposite of empty. Outside, Miguel called for them to come see something he had found in the barn.
Elena looked at David, at this good man who was offering her more than she'd ever dared to dream of, and made her choice. Okay, she said simply. Okay? Okay, I'll try. We'll try. 3 months, and we'll see what happens. David's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He started to reach for her, then stopped, clearly remembering her need for boundaries, for time to rebuild trust. Thank you, he said instead, for giving us a chance. They called the children in to explore the house, watching as Sofia and Miguel ran from room to room, their voices echoing in the empty spaces with excitement and possibility. Sofia claimed the yellow room immediately, spinning in circles by the window seat. Miguel stood quietly in his potential bedroom, looking out at the pasture with the same thoughtful expression he'd inherited from his father. "Mama," he said finally, "is this going to be our house?" Elena knelt down to his level, taking his hands in hers. "What do you think? Would you like it to be?" Miguel nodded solemnly. "I think Daddy would like knowing we found somewhere safe." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she pulled her son close. Out of the mouths of babes came the wisdom she needed to hear. David, his father, would want them to be safe and happy. He would want them to find love again, to build a family that honored his memory by moving forward. "I think you're right," she whispered into Miguel's hair. That evening, as they drove back to their apartment to begin the process of packing their few belongings, Sofia fell asleep in the back seat, clutching a wildflower she'd picked from the ranch yard. Miguel sat quietly, watching the landscape scroll past the windows. "When can we move?" he asked, as they pulled into the parking lot of their current building. "Next weekend," Elena answered, still not quite believing the words.
David is going to help us move next weekend." As she carried her sleeping daughter up the stairs to their soon-to-be former home, Elena thought about the conversation she'd had with David before they left the ranch. He'd explained his vision for the property, his plans for raising horses and maybe some cattle, for hosting riding lessons for local children. He'd talked about building something that would benefit the whole community, creating jobs and opportunities in a town that needed both. But more than that, he'd talked about creating a place where children could learn about responsibility and nature, where families could come together, where healing could happen through honest work and open sky. It was a beautiful vision, and Elena found herself wanting to be part of making it real. Over the next week, Elena gave notice at all 3 of her jobs. Bill and Martha at the diner were sad to see her go, but happy for her chance at something better. Rose at the roadhouse was more direct in her approval. "About time someone saw what you're worth," she said, hugging Elena tightly. "That cowboy of yours has good sense." Elena packed their belongings with help from Mrs. Garcia, who had become more than a neighbor over their 2 years in the building. She was the closest thing to family Elena had found in Millbrook, and leaving her felt like losing an anchor. "You'll visit," Mrs. Garcia said firmly as she helped fold the children's clothes. "And you'll call me if that man turns out to be anything other than what he seems." "I will," she promised. Moving day arrived gray and drizzly, typical weather for late autumn in Colorado. David showed up with his truck and a trailer, along with his Aunt Margaret and 2 other men he introduced as neighboring ranchers who'd volunteered to help. Elena was touched by the gesture, by the way this community she barely knew had rallied to welcome her. The apartment that had felt so cramped for 2 years emptied quickly when carried out by willing hands. Elena's few pieces of furniture, the children's toys and books, their clothes and personal items, it all fit easily into one truckload. Looking around the bare rooms, Elena felt a mixture of relief and nostalgia. This place had been their shelter when they needed it most, their launching pad into independence. "Ready?" David asked, finding her standing in the empty living room. Elena took one last look around, then closed the door firmly behind her. "Ready." The drive to the ranch felt different this time, charged with possibility and permanence. Sofia and Miguel chattered excitedly in the back seat, making plans for their new rooms, talking about the horses David had promised they could help choose. When they pulled up the gravel driveway, Elena saw smoke rising from the chimney and lights glowing in the windows. David had been there earlier, she realized, making sure the house was warm and welcoming for their arrival. Unloading took no time at all with so many hands helping. By late afternoon, Elena's meager possessions were distributed throughout the spacious house, looking almost lost in rooms designed for larger lives. But it didn't matter. They would grow into this space, fill it with memories and laughter and the accumulated treasures of a life lived fully. That first night, Elena tucked her children into their new beds, Sofia in the yellow room with the morning light, Miguel in the room overlooking the pasture. They both fell asleep quickly, exhausted by excitement and change. Elena found David in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the pizza they'd ordered for dinner. Through the window, she could see the lights of Millbrook twinkling in the distance, close enough to reach, but far enough away to feel like they'd entered a different world. "Any regrets?" David asked. Not turning around from the sink, Elena considered the question seriously.
Tonight, she was standing in a beautiful kitchen in a house that could become her home, watching a good man wash dishes while her children slept safely in their own rooms. "No regrets," she said firmly, "but I'm still scared." David turned to face her, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Scared of what?" "Scared that I'll mess this up somehow. Scared that I don't know how to be part of a partnership anymore. Scared that you'll realize I'm not worth all this trouble." David set down the towel and stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his storm cloud eyes.
Elena, you've already proven your worth 100 times over. The way you've raised those children, the way you fought for them, the way you've stayed strong when everything was against you, that's worth everything. What if I disappoint you? What if you don't? What if this works better than either of us dared to hope? David reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. Elena, I'm scared too. I'm scared that I'll say the wrong thing or move too fast or somehow hurt you when all I want to do is protect you. But I think being scared together is better than being scared alone. Elena looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from honest work, hers small and marked by years of service. Together, they looked like they could handle whatever came next. "One day at a time?" she asked. "One day at a time," David agreed. 6 months later, Elena stood on the same screened porch where David had first outlined his vision for their life together. The backyard was green with spring growth, and in the pasture beyond, 3 horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Sofia and Miguel were out there too, mucking stalls under David's patient supervision, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Elena's hands were covered in soil from the garden she had been planting, vegetables and flowers that would bloom and feed them through the summer. The ranch was thriving under their combined care, with 2 part-time ranch hands and a waiting list of children eager for riding lessons. But more than that, Elena was thriving. She had gained weight in healthy places, her constant exhaustion had been replaced by the satisfying tiredness that came from meaningful work, and her children had bloomed like flowers given proper soil and sunlight. "Mama," Sofia called from the pasture, "come see how well I can brush Buttercup." Elena waved and called back that she'd be right there. As she washed the soil from her hands, she caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd knocked on David's door that first morning at the diner. This woman's eyes held joy instead of desperation, confidence instead of fear. David appeared beside her reflection, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. It had taken months for her to be comfortable with casual affection, but now his touch felt like home. "Happy?" he asked, resting his chin on top of her head. Elena leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and utterly dependable. "Impossibly happy." "Good, because I have something to ask you." Elena turned in his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" David grinned, the expression lighting up his entire face. "That depends on your answer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee right there in their kitchen while their children's laughter drifted through the open windows. "Elena Martinez, you've made this house a home and made me remember what it means to be part of a family. You've shown Sofia and Miguel what it looks like when someone chooses love over fear, hope over surrender. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in taking this leap of faith?" Elena looked down at this good man, this cowboy who had offered her 1 job instead of 3, who had kept every promise he had made, who had shown her children what a father's love looked like. Through the window, she could see Sofia and Miguel racing toward the house, having spotted David on his knee. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as naturally as breathing. "Yes to all of it." As David slipped the ring onto her finger and Sofia and Miguel burst through the door demanding to know what was happening, Elena thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From 3 jobs and an uncertain future to 1 job and a lifetime of certainty. Loving this family, tending this land, building something beautiful together. It was, she decided, the best job she had ever had.